that are on the horizon that will be, again, specific to our region, and as well as the state. And then I want to really do more of a kind of a call to action that with some of the opportunities that are on the horizon, it will require a lot of collaboration and to be prepared to harness those resources to help people in need to the fullest extent possible right now during the crisis and as we emerge out of the crisis. And so I really hope, and I know that our region, Inland Empire, has always been very collaborative in nature in general. So I know that this comes somewhat natural to us. But again, I think with the unprecedented times, the depth that we can collaborate among stakeholders, but most importantly as a region, as a true Riverside and Bernardino County, that will allow us to be as well positioned as possible. So I want to begin by also acknowledging that besides me, being from the Inland Empire, I'm based in Riverside specifically. We also have, in terms of the synchronicity right now on workforce, Jeff Stone, who some of you might have known or know. He's a former Riverside County Board of Supervisor. He was a former state legislator in California. He was representing the Marietta Temecula area. He was appointed by the president as a Western Regional Director for the U.S. On Department of Labor, and so essentially, kind of my counterpart at the federal level is also based. Even though I think he recently moved out of the region, but he's somebody who's very familiar. Was an elected office in the Inland Empire. And I want to give him a shout out because he's been extremely responsive to making sure that all of our coordination between state and federal government has been as coordinated as it can be in terms of communication, responsiveness. He's been extremely helpful, and I consider him a friend as well. And so just wanted you guys to be aware that, both at state and federal level, you have good representation from the Inland Empire. I also just want to mention too that, regarding the nature of the convening that the Inland Empire Chamber and Edward has put together here, it's been, normally the audiences that I've been interfacing with are purely really just business leaders in a vacuum. And I think we have a good cross section of stakeholders that are actually, involved in the workforce system, whether it's government, education, and others. So again, I think that's fantastic. From the governor's perspective, I know that, again, speaking on a personal level, that people in Inland California in general have always felt that the state does not give them as much attention and as much respect and responsiveness to our needs as the coastal communities do in terms of voice, representation, allocation of resources. And I'm not going to push back on that assertion. I think historically that's definitely been the case. I can tell you that this Governor Gavin Newsom, is really wanting to place a great amount of emphasis and engagement in Inland California in general. And one of his initiatives that he launched right out of his election was called Regions Rising. Some of you are probably familiar with that. It initially was really about addressing the economic equity gaps between inland and coastal. It's kind of evolved beyond that, about the connectivity of regions, on how we can all collectively, elevate California as a whole. But that underlying principle of giving a lot of strategic thought about Central Valley, Inland Empire, places like that, is really still an important driver of that effort. And initially, from those efforts in the California Economic Summit that Governor Newsom held, it was based in Fresno. There's been a lot of motion and investments being announced for the Central Valley area. Fresno kind of being at the epicenter of it. And a lot of my colleagues and peers here in the Inland Empire were concerned about what this means for our region. And I can tell you a few things just to kind of give feedback on this. One is that our region is very large. Obviously, physically, we all know how large it is. But also just the nature of population density and the range of stakeholders. I think it's more complicated, I think, for us to coordinate some kind of a regional vision that the governors and the administration can respond to. That being said, there's a lot of momentum towards these efforts. The two counties themselves, the County of Riverside and San Bernardino, as the government agencies, IEP, UC Riverside, a lot of different stakeholders, the community colleges, are starting to, I think, gain a lot more traction on articulating to the governor and the administration what that vision can be. Now, all of this was prior to COVID-19, but one of the key developments from that we haven't publicly shared, but I want to give all of you a heads up about this, was the governor was willing to greenlight the California Workforce Development Board to use some of our discretionary funding to make strategic investments in the Inland Empire. And this was something that the governor, again, personally wanted to engage on. Fortunately for us, even amidst the pandemic, our momentum from the labor agency through our Secretary of Labor, Julie Su, and the staff and the workforce development team have been able to continue those efforts unimpeded. And so we are actually targeting June 15th. It's not a hard and final date. Again, this isn't public information. I'm just giving you guys a heads up. But June 15th, we are targeting to actually put out a non-competitive RFP, again, just specifically for the Inland Empire, to help establish a regional training center here in this region. And I think the closest analogy I can think to this would be the intake center in Fontana. That was a regional consortium of Chaffey College, and was kind of at the center of it, but it had representation from community colleges throughout in the desert area, Riverside, and the whole region. And it was a partnership with California Steel. The difference, I think, with the way that we're trying to approach this effort is we're really emphasizing the term high road. And so the term high road, as Governor Newsom defines it, is really about the quality of jobs. It's about looking at workforce development from a climate lens, from a worker voice perspective, and again, the quality of job in terms of working conditions, compensation, benefits, and so forth. And so, one of the criticisms of workforce system nationally is that there's such an emphasis on immediate placement and the lack of the workforce development part, the actual skills upskilling the workers so that they can break and transcend the cycles of poverty. That gets kind of lost in the shuffle. And so in California, we are really trying to emphasize that the investments that we want to make are really towards the development side of workforce, and not just placing low-skilled workers efficiently into other low-skilled jobs in perpetuity. Obviously, there's opportunities for people to get experience and move up, but the key is that there is some mobility there. There's an opportunity for people to get out of their economic circumstances. And so that is the principle of how we want to approach these regional training centers, to have those kinds of lens. Right now, the traction that I'm seeing, from the region on how that concept is being developed is really being led by the Inland Empire Central Labor Council, led by Ricardo Cisneros, and the AFL-CIO in general is obviously a consortium of a lot of different labor unions, and the Inland Empire Central Labor Council is one of the largest in the country. But the reason, partially, a lot of those job quality components are present in labor, but also the infrastructure, so that that we can really make a meaningful impact. So with the sense I'm getting, and again, this is kind of unofficial, is that the first training center might be focused on kind of advanced transportation technologies, electrifying trucks and things of that nature. Again, specifics are to be developed by the region itself, but this is the feedback I'm receiving from stakeholders. But I encourage any stakeholder that would want to engage in these regional training center concepts, the high road training center concepts, to contact your local workforce development agency and see how you can plug in. Again, I'm giving you guys kind of a heads up on this. There's not a formal solicitation out publicly yet that you can respond to. But again, our goal is to get this out before the end of June. So it's not too far on the horizon, and so it can at least spark some discourse. The other thing to speak about this as well is our goal, and again, I say this on behalf of the governor and Secretary of Labor also, was to actually fund potentially multiple regional training, high road regional training centers. So this first phase, we could be putting out the proposal, like I said, as early as June, but we're hoping that that's not going to be the only one. And I really want to emphasize that everything I'm mentioning right now is specific to the Inland Empire. This is not something that is a statewide solicitation. These are efforts for the governor to really emphasize here. And again, kudos to the administration to get these things in motion even before the pandemic. And we know that in inland California or inland parts of anywhere in the country are usually disproportionately more impacted during downturns in economies and have less resiliency to recover rapidly. So I think that these efforts are actually going to be even more important in responding to this pandemic now. I also, so in terms of time frame for the other phases, we kind of want it to be based on what kinds of traction that stakeholders have in setting up partnerships that would be conducive to a regional training center being impactful, right? So employer engagement, having, community colleges are typically at the fulcrum of many training efforts. But having a good consortium. So some of the other sectors that I've gotten feedback that could be viable are related to IT, to public sector apprenticeships, and to healthcare. And I'll just say again, generally speaking, the governor has a goal to have 500,000 apprenticeships within the next 10 years. And so that model, and again, putting in the lens of high road is going to be a priority of this administration. So I want to pivot a little bit now to kind of what the statewide response has been during the pandemic. So as you can imagine, that unemployment has been dominating the news as it relates to the workforce system, and the scale of it is just devastating. I know that many of you guys on this call already have some kind of point of reference to relate to just how challenging the circumstance is, but the state was prepared and staffed to take on maybe a few thousand claims at any given time, and now it's in the hundreds of thousands that the state EDD is having to take on. And the governor has been, trying to be adapt to this environment as quickly as possible. We've now had call centers 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. The processing of unemployment claims extend beyond the business hours to weekends, evenings, to get people urgently the resources they need. We have over 1,300 state employees now assigned to this effort. And it's not just the scale of the numbers and the immediacy of what the surge of unemployment claims are, but it's also, I think people have, hopefully can have perspective that we are expanding the eligibility of unemployment in unprecedented fashions. And on top of all of that, as you might have heard, we are now processing unemployment claims for gig workers, independent contractors, and so these new programs being deployed simultaneously with the volume of claims that are happening, and on top of the fact that we have to keep our own state employees safe and managing that aspect of this process, it's been a daunting undertaking. I really want to commend Secretary of Labor Julie Su and her staff on the fullest extent that they're trying. Now, obviously, I know that people have had frustrating experiences during this time, and we want to be sympathetic to that. But I just want to caution, just express to all of you in a heartfelt way that it's not for a lack of trying to handle that demand. And there's a program now, PEUC, which is part of the CARES Act, that is just being deployed within the next week, where the people that had exhausted their unemployment benefits prior to the COVID-19, we will be able to start processing those claims as well. And so, I really feel like the employees are approaching this in a way that extends beyond their job description and duties, but as a call to action to help people in a very critical time. And as you guys might have heard as well, that Governor Newsom, first in the country, and I think might be still the only governor in the country who was able to set up a fund for undocumented workers. I know that there's lawsuits and some criticism about this, but I hope people can understand that when there's some estimates that 10% of our workforce in California is undocumented and they have no eligibility for these federal unemployment or stimulus benefits, and they collectively contribute billions of dollars of taxes, and vulnerable population, that providing this support one time, $500 for an adult or $1,000 one time for a household, is an extraordinary effort on behalf of our governor to do, and it's being administered through local nonprofits. Not the state directly, but the state is part of a public-private consortium to fund it. In terms of the workforce surges, we've really been doing what we refer to as high road labor exchanges to have workers that are in non-essential sectors being skilled and transitioning to essential workers. It's becoming less of an issue now, proportionately speaking, because of the fact that the economy slowly in phases and thoughtfully is starting to open up. But one example was Unite, some of the hospitality workers transitioning to food workers, and again the healthcare aspect. The governor was able to have retired healthcare professionals and medical students getting into the workforce immediately to help with the surge in demand. So I also want to share another example about some funding that's on the horizon very soon. Is the SB1, the Transportation Infrastructure Funding. So most people commonly know it as the gas tax, and it's obviously a very substantial amount of overall funding. Now, part of that funding for the infrastructure is actually a carve out to Workforce Development Board for training. And these are very high quality jobs, as people can imagine, with livable wages, excellent benefits. I'm pleased to share that we're just in the final stage of announcing that funding soon. It's really just a formality of a bureaucratic formality that I'm hoping could be resolved by next week even. And Inland Empire will be receiving funding from that. And so that's going to be a great opportunity to get people to work in quality jobs. I can tell you that from the State Workforce Board perspective, our biggest emphasis on these transportation infrastructure jobs is going to be a commitment to deep outreach to underserved communities. Prior to the COVID-19, this was already our principle. that we want this to be an opportunity to get people that have traditionally barriers to employment, whether it's prison to employment or whatever represents underserved communities, that they have an opportunity to be engaged in these efforts. And I think now, again, with the pandemic, you can imagine that communities that are typically not getting access to employment opportunities are going to have even a bigger challenge with this crisis. So I really hope that our community can really do some deep outreach and take advantage of those training funds that are coming, like I said, very, very soon. In the Inland Empire, as typically in other regions that applied for these funds, it's the building trades that are kind of the point of contact. And so Bill Perez with the building trades for the Inland Empire is kind of the lead on that. But they're underneath the Inland Empire Central Labor Council and Ricardo Cisneros. And so kudos to them to getting the application together and making sure that our region is represented. But again, that's should be announced very, very soon. So hopefully we can get people to work through that. I also want to share that there's a big emphasis on collaboration within the administration. The Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, or as we refer to it as GoBiz, in conjunction with the Workforce Development Board, have been working on helping manufacturers transition towards production of PPE that are not being utilized otherwise. And I want to give a shout out specifically to Riverside County Workforce Board and staff for really being very active in this effort. But obviously San Bernardino County and others are engaged in this as well. But this is really powerful because it not only gets people jobs during this pandemic and keeps people working, but you can imagine that the intangible value of having a local supply of PPE equipment is so important right now, with so much uncertainty looming in terms of the extent and of how long this crisis will loom until vaccines and other treatments are available. And so we really hope that in the Inland Empire and other places in the state that we can have robust local manufacturing on those efforts. Regarding America Job Centers, they've typically throughout the state, they're kind of on an appointment basis or virtual. My understanding is we're really looking to start phasing in openings in a safe manner soon, as early as June. And so that I think will be an invaluable resource. I also want to share about, with the governor's budget, as you guys know, there's a huge projected shortfall, over $50 billion throughout the time frame. Part of that budget, and this was even prior to the COVID-19, was the proposal for Governor Newsom to establish a Department of Better Jobs and Higher Wages. It's essentially a consolidation of the Employment Development Department, Employment Training Panel, the California Workforce Development Board, and the Division of Apprenticeship Standards. I think, again, as a lot of the things that I've shared on this chat, this is another example of something that's even more critical now than it was prior to the crisis. The opportunity to have a more strategic coordination, streamlined efforts between data that informs our policies and decisions, as well as workforce development responses, is even more imperative. So we're actually going to be having some important hearings with state legislatures tomorrow, or actually today, actually. So I'm hopeful that this will still move forward in the budget that ends up being adopted. I think it's very important, and I encourage all of you that have relationships with your state legislators to take this issue very seriously. On the State Workforce Development Board itself, we have 4 state legislators as members, and one of them is from the Inland Empire, State Senator Connie Leyva. But again, this is something that I think requires greater awareness. And I also, the last thing I want to say, and then I can address some questions that people have and get other input, is the kind of what I mentioned earlier about the call to action, because really right now, I think one thing that's very that we can all be cautiously optimistic about is that whatever dysfunction that people perceive and believe, which to some extent is reality, that any form of government is the adequacy of their response to crisis, that workforce development seems to be something that's going to have a high degree of bipartisan interest in terms of priority of funding and implementation in terms of the response. So in light of that, I think it's important that regions and stakeholders are prepared to take advantage of that. You might have heard that congressional Democrats had introduced a proposed $15 billion additional workforce stimulus funding called Relaunching America's Workforce Act, RAWA. And it's clearly something that needs to be still negotiated, and it seems that the Senate is going to take up this issue and consideration in June. But again, cautiously optimistic that it's a matter of what the final terms will look like, and not a reflection of whether or not Congress believes that this is something that's warranted. And I'll say that just my high-level kind of reaction to what was proposed in that $15 billion extra stimulus, that one thing I was very pleased with is the emphasis on youth. And I'm a little biased as a Riverside School Board member, but I think objectively speaking, I believe youth unemployment rate is about 33% right now. So I think objectively, that's something that really requires a lot of attention. In that proposal, $2.5 billion is being proposed for youth workforce investment activities, and $250 million for youth build, and then apprenticeships in general, which is obviously something that you could have a youth component of pre-apprenticeships. $500 million being proposed, and $2 billion for the community college and industry partnership grants, which for those of you that were involved during the Great Recession time, that was the TAC grants. And that's what the intake center in Inland Empire in Fontana was based off of. So I think these are very promising signs that very substantial amount of resources are potentially going to be coming here. So I wanted you guys to be aware that we're not just having our eye on being responsive to the immediacy of processing unemployment claims, which is obviously the top priority right now, but we're simultaneously trying to look ahead and making sure that we are thoughtful and strategic on how we approach this. And again, I really believe that the Inland Empire, with our spirit of collaboration and just our experiences coming out of the Great Recession, which this federal legislation that I mentioned before is actually modeled after the Great Recession response. So I think I've probably been saying a lot, just unilaterally. So I welcome people's reactions or feedback. But again, the biggest takeaway that I hope that you guys have is that our region is being heard and has a voice in the administration. And two, there's a lot of opportunity on the horizon that we can collectively, respond to and help our residents during this time of need.
Very good. Mr. Farooq, Edward here with the Regional Chamber. A question for you. As our workforce liaison to Sacramento, what do you need from the business community to assist you in representing the Inland Empire?
That's a great question. So, Governor Newsom formed a task force of major industry leaders And I'll tell you, one, I mean, if you look at the list of people, they represent, generally speaking, pretty large sectors and companies and so forth. I had personally shared with the governor just about a week ago that I felt there needs to be more voice from inland California and smaller businesses and things like of that nature to have that perspective about how we should be approaching this. The governor was very responsive to that. But the point I want to make with your question is that it's really just for you guys to share what's happening on the ground. And again, I can be one potential conduit to it, but we don't want the decision making to be happening in a bubble where it's a one size fits all kind of mentality on how we handle this crisis and how we transition from it. And the only way we can do that is if businesses speak up and tell us what their perspectives are. And so this platform that Edward, that you've convened here, this is an example of a way that I hope, that businesses can share what they're hearing on the ground.
Very good. Thank you. Well, we'll also do a questionnaire to all the participants in this webinar and let them, submit any questions where you can answer in depth at your convenience. But let's open it up to some questions. Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Farooq?
So if you want, I could start with my friend Keith. He's a local Riverside parent. I can address his question. So, I think, so Keith's question is about special needs and disabled in the job force and a value, an asset to workforce. I think, so again, to my point earlier, it's not something that it's a matter of whether we're overlooking that or not. It's actually a priority. And anybody who would be considered kind of an underserved population, which that includes special needs and disabled, we really want to make a concerted effort to give them priority for a lot of the funding opportunities that we're doing. So that's definitely by design. But again, I hope that the only way we can be successful in those efforts is that outreach is able to reach the people that actually need it. And only through community-based partnerships can we make that happen. So I hope that people, that are on this call can be a conduit towards that. So the next comment is about the CalTAP organization, veterans transitioning into the workforce. Again, I think, one, I mean, I think everybody recognizes the extraordinary service that veterans do for our country to keep us safe. And I can tell you that in a good fashion, that this is another area where there's bipartisan. This is where usually politics don't, get involved in it. And so I think veterans getting priority, that's already basically factored into our workforce system, period. But I think that's not something we ever need to be concerned about being not taken seriously in future funding or anything like that, because again, there's widespread bipartisan gratitude for veterans transitioning into the workforce. So the next comment is from Kathy regarding folks making PPE or having problems getting orders or finding connections, make it easier to sign purchase orders to Cal. So if you are experiencing those things, that's exactly what GoBiz is. That's the role that GoBiz is playing to help local manufacturers. So either you can shoot me an email. I included my email above in the chat, or the most effective way is to do it through staff. If you have relationships with Riverside County or San Bernardino County Workforce Development, they can coordinate, which they ongoingly do with GoBiz. But as it relates to those questions that you were saying about PPE, that's the side of the equation that GoBiz is handling. The next question I have is, will there be an increase to rapid response money? So when you say increase, I guess there's two ways that I can interpret that. One is in terms of time. So as I'm sure a lot of you know, that the $600 extra weekly extra unemployment benefit is actually going to be expiring at the end of July. So one part of the response to your question could be, is that going to be extended? That's purely in the domain of Congress. So if you want that to be extended, I would encourage you to contact your congressional members, representatives, and encourage them to do that. In terms of the amount, same thing. In California, the cap for weekly benefits is $450, and with this unique PUC unemployment benefit from the CARES Act from Congress, it's $600 a week on top of whatever amount between $40 to $450 that you're receiving. That's again something in terms of the $600 and the amount that's within the federal government's purview. So unless they give any direction otherwise, those caps will remain. The next question is, I'm interested in the training center, employer-focused career development program. How can we be involved? So the best way to coordinate is through your county workforce development centers. If you don't have a contact with them, I'm assuming some of them are on this chat, and maybe they can type in their contact information. But if you need me to forward you to them, again, I'm happy to get an email from you and connect you with them. But they would be the best people to help coordinate your participation in that. Next question, Moises Cisneros. How do we safeguard jobs from being lost to automation, especially in the Inland Empire? Concentration of warehouse jobs, robotics might displace many blue-collar workers. So I think, there's been some economists, and I won't name names, but giving this kind of assertion that, well, this isn't a typical recession in the sense that it was, the pandemic, quote unquote, artificially stopped or slowed down the economy, and that the moment that we lift these provisions, that everything's going to snap back. And the reality is to Moises's point, whether it's employers feeling like, okay, I'm worried about workman's comp. I'm worried about all these regulations about protecting my workers and the cost associated with that. I'm just going to now invest in technology to phase out the need to even bring back these employees to offset that. I think that's a real concern from a workforce system standpoint, that businesses are making that calculus and determination. And the only way we can really address that is twofold. I mean, one, we need to be investing in sectors that can be more insulated from automation and these technological replacements, so to speak. That's one aspect. And that's why, for example, with the high road regional training centers that we're hoping we can get going in the Inland Empire, for example, we really want to have a mindfulness about that there's sectors that are going to be sustainable beyond automation. And then the second part in terms of the response to that is that we need to upskill workers so that the value add and contribution that they can provide an employer extends something beyond what a machine can do. And so on both of those fronts, I believe that the state is trying to be very judicious and thoughtful about our workforce investments so that we can provide that. Next comment, since many in the restaurant industry workers will no longer have a business to return to, is the WIB going to target those people with specific new skills training in new industries? So yes, absolutely. And so part of, so generally speaking, I don't want to give kind of a one size fits all because every local community has different sectors that are more viable than others. But I think generally speaking, healthcare is an area where there's a insufficient skilled workforce currently, irrespective of the crisis. And you can imagine a pandemic the need will be even further greater. So I think that's a sector that probably will be applicable towards that, to addressing your question. But we're seeing a lot of interest in information technology, coding, and again, I'll put on kind of my school board hat on this, but coding is a type of skill set that does not require a bachelor's degree to get high quality wages, and that's an enormous demand. And I think with the California Air Resources Board research facility coming to be headquartered in the Inland Empire in the next, on the horizon, that creates another opportunity for the clean sector related investments and industries to come around the Air Resources Board as a cluster, and that can be very viable as well. Leslie Trainer is providing her email, and again, she's a fantastic, very responsive resource to follow up on some of those questions that you guys had on connecting with PPE production and so forth. The next question, Coachella Valley needs employment opportunities that are not so seasonally based. Absolutely. So we need year-round non-hospitality. So, I had a Zoom call recently with the mayor, vice mayor, and the city manager of Palm Springs. Now, I'm not saying Palm Springs is representative of the Coachella Valley overall, but this was the main issue that came up. I can tell you that this is, again, where I think whether it's the regional training centers that are being proposed, we could hopefully have them geographically dispersed, maybe one in the desert area, one in Riverside County, maybe one in San Bernardino County. But it's not just the geographical distribution, but that they could specialize in specific areas. So conceivably, identifying what kinds of sectors in Coachella Valley that you guys would like to expand to, and maybe having some discussions with your workforce staff. And again, Leslie can be a great point of contact on that, and we can explore that. Again, those funding examples that I mentioned, resources are coming. So it's a matter of how do you guys want to respond to that? And I can't stress enough that the employer piece, the industry engagement piece is going to be very, very important in ensuring that these training centers don't just become places where your people are getting skills and then there's not a job at the end of it. And even with the unemployment and everything, we want those jobs, again, to be long-term sustainable. Being able to bring training out to Coachella participants to travel, high-paying jobs. We definitely recognize some of those regional challenges. And again, that's why I think the Inland Empire is so unique and requires so much support, because just the geographic distance alone for the two counties is extraordinary. So we welcome everyone's input on how we can address that. Will the local workforce development departments offer upskill training grants? So a lot of the things that I mentioned, they usually, so our state board, when it comes to WIOA funding, right, Workforce Innovation Opportunities Act funding, it'll come to the state board, and some of it's formulaically given out to have local autonomy at the local county workforce board levels. And then some of it we use discretionary where they apply ourselves. But for the most part, it's really locally, we put a lot of premium on local control. And we do put some conditions about how we would like those funds to be used. Again, from the state workforce board perspective, we are really committed to putting an emphasis on upskill training. So I believe that both Riverside and San Bernardino County workforce centers share that sentiment. So I'm optimistic that will be the case for Deanna's question. And then the next question, Apply Education Services is working with, okay, so that's just informational. So I don't know if you guys have any other questions, but again, I'm locally based, so I'm happy to to be a resource for you guys, beyond this Zoom, this Google Hangout.
Yeah, that's great, Dr. Farooq. I think that's our time. Let's see if we have any last minute questions. Yeah, we don't, but yeah, thank you. This is great information, great intel for the business community in the Inland Empire. That's going to conclude this webinar. I will follow up with all of you via email. I will have a copy to this webinar to share with you all. Again, any questions, concerns, you can email me directly, Edward Ornelas at the Regional Chamber. You all should have my information. And I want to thank you all again for helping us to run a flawless webinar. So thank you all, and thank you, Dr. Farooq. You enjoy your day.
Take care.
Bye.